Robert Nesta Marley was born on the 6th of February 1945 in 9 Mile, a small village in the parish of St. Anne, Jamaica. The son of Norvo Sinclair Marley, a white Jamaican of English descent, and Cedella Booker, a black Jamaican teenager, Bob grew up caught between two worlds. His mixed heritage made him an outsider in his own community, where he faced prejudice and questions about his identity. This early experience of not quite belonging anywhere would later fuel his universal message of unity and acceptance. His father was largely absent from his life, and Bob was raised by his mother in poverty. The rural poverty of 9 Mile, with its lush green hills and tight-knit community, shaped his early worldview. Music was everywhere, in the churches, in the streets, in the very air of Jamaica. Young Bob would listen to American R&B on the radio, absorbing the sounds of Fats Domino and Ray Charles, while also being influenced by the traditional mento and ska music of his homeland. Wailers are born. In 1963, at just 18 years old, Bob formed a group called the Wailers with his friends Peter Tosh and Bunny Livingston, later known as Bunny Wailer. They were discovered by legendary Jamaican producer Coxsone Dodd at Studio One. Their first single, Simmer Down, became a #1 hit in Jamaica in 1964, launching Bob into the local music scene. But success didn't bring wealth. The music industry in Jamaica was notoriously exploitative, and Bob struggled financially throughout the 1960 seconds. He even moved to Delaware in 1966 to work in a Chrysler plant and a warehouse, trying to make enough money to support his new wife, Rita Anderson, whom he had married that same year. Spiritual awakening Bob's conversion to Rastafari in the late 1960 seconds transformed everything. Rastafari wasn't just a religion to him, it was a revolutionary philosophy that addressed the colonial oppression of black people worldwide. Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia was viewed as the Messiah, and Rastafari taught that black people would find redemption through repatriation to Africa. Bob grew his hair into dreadlocks, embraced the sacramental use of marijuana, and began infusing his music with spiritual and political messages. The Wailers' sound evolved from ska to the slower bass-heavy rhythm of reggae, which had emerged in Jamaica in the late 1960 seconds. Bob's songwriting matured, addressing themes of suffering, resistance, faith, and liberation. Act 2. The Global Prophet 1000, 972 to 1980. Breakthrough. Everything changed in 1972 when the Wailers signed with Island Records and its visionary founder Chris Blackwell. Blackwell recognized that Bob's message could transcend Jamaica and reach a global audience. He gave the Wailers creative control and a proper recording budget, luxuries they had never experienced before. In 1973, the Wailers released Catch a Fire, followed quickly by Burnin'. That same year, these albums introduced the world to a new kind of reggae, politically conscious, spiritually deep, and musically sophisticated. Songs like Get Up, Stand Up, I Shot the Sheriff, and Burning and Looting became anthems of resistance. When Eric Clapton covered I Shot the Sheriff in 1974, reaching #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, Bob Marley became an international sensation. Suddenly, the boy from 9 Mile was on the world stage. The solo star Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer left the group in 1974, unable to handle the grueling international touring schedule and creative differences. Bob continued as Bob Marley and the Wailers, with his wife Rita and Masha Griffiths, and Judy Mowat providing backup vocals. The albums came in rapid succession, each one a masterpiece. Natty Dread, 1974. Rastaman Vibration, 1976. Exodus, 1977. Gaia, 1978. And Survival, 1979. Bob was no longer just a musician. He was a prophet, a revolutionary, a voice for the oppressed. His concerts became spiritual experiences, whether performing in London, Tokyo, or Johannesburg, Bob had an almost supernatural ability to connect with audiences. His thin frame would move with explosive energy, his dreadlocks flying as he danced, his voice carrying messages of love, resistance, and redemption. Political turmoil, Bob's increasing political influence made him a target. In December 1976, just 2 days before he was scheduled to perform at the Smile Jamaica concert, a free event meant to ease political tensions in Jamaica, gunmen invaded his home at 56 Hope Road in Kingston. Bob, Rita, and their manager Don Taylor were all shot. Bob was hit in the chest and arm, Rita in the head, and Taylor was seriously wounded. Miraculously, they all survived. 2 days later, Bob performed at the concert anyway, showing his wounds to the audience. The people who are trying to make this world worse aren't taking a day off, he said. How can I? The assassination attempt forced Bob into temporary exile. He spent the next 18 months in London,
where he recorded Exodus, an album that would later be named Album of the Century by Time magazine. In 1978, Bob returned to Jamaica for the One Love Peace concert.
In an iconic moment, he brought rival political leaders Michael Manley and Edward Seaga on stage and joined their hands above his head, a symbol of his desire for unity over division. The peak. By 1980, Bob Marley and the Wailers were one of the biggest touring acts in the world. Bob had transcended reggae. He was a global icon, his message of one love resonating across cultures, races, and continents. He performed to massive crowds, bringing Rastafari and Jamaican culture to places that had never heard them before. His music spoke to the oppressed everywhere, from African liberation movements to inner-city youth in America and Europe. Songs like Redemption Song, No Woman, No Cry, Three Little Birds, and One Love became timeless anthems. Bob seemed unstoppable. He had 11 legitimate children with 7 different women and was working on yet another album. Plans were underway for a massive world tour. But beneath the surface, something was terribly wrong. Act 3. The Final Battle 1000. 977 to 1981. The injury. In July 1977, during a friendly football match in Paris, Bob was a passionate footballer. He injured his right big toe. It seemed like nothing, just another sports injury. Bob continued touring, but the toe didn't heal properly. It became discolored and painful. When he finally saw a doctor in London, the diagnosis was shocking. Acro-lentiginous melanoma, a rare and aggressive form of skin cancer that occurs on the palms of hands or soles of feet. This type of melanoma is more common in people of African descent, and is particularly deadly because it's often detected late. The doctors recommended immediate amputation of the toe, but Bob refused. As a Rastafarian, he believed in the sanctity of the body. The idea of amputation was spiritually unacceptable. Rasta no abide. Amputation. I don't allow a man to be dismantled, he said. Instead, Bob agreed to a less invasive surgery excision of the nail and nail bed. It was a compromise, but one that would prove fatal. The doctors warned him that this might not be enough, that the cancer could spread. Bob chose to believe he would be fine. Denial and persistence. For the next 3 years, Bob Marley continued at a relentless pace. He kept touring, kept recording, kept performing. The Babylon by Bus tour in 1978, the Survival tour in 1979, and finally the Uprising tour in 1980 took him across the globe. But there were warning signs. Bob began to lose weight. He experienced dizzy spells and headaches. His stamina on stage began to wane, though he pushed through with sheer willpower. Those close to him noticed he was becoming thinner, more fragile, though his spirit remained fierce. The cancer, unbeknownst to most, had metastasized. It was spreading through his body, traveling from his toe to his vital organs. By 1980, the melanoma had reached his lungs, liver, and brain. The collapse. On the 21st of September 1980, Bob Marley and the Wailers performed 2 shows at Madison Square Garden in New York City. It was a triumphant moment, a former symbol of how far Bob had come from 9 Mile. The shows were electric, but Bob was struggling. He had collapsed during a jogging session in Central Park shortly before the concert, a sign that his body was failing.
After the Madison Square Garden shows, Bob and the band traveled to Pittsburgh for a performance at the Stanley Theater on September 23. During this concert, Bob collapsed on stage.
The tour was immediately canceled. Bob was taken to Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York, where tests revealed the horrifying truth. The cancer had spread throughout his body. There were tumors in his brain, lungs, and liver. The doctors gave him weeks to live. The desperate search for conventional medicine had given up on Bob, but he refused to accept his fate. In a desperate search for alternative treatment, Bob traveled to Germany to see Dr. Joseph Isels, a controversial physician who claimed to have revolutionary cancer treatments. Dr. Isels' clinic in the Bavarian mountains offered a holistic approach that combined diet, supplements, and experimental therapies. Bob spent months there, undergoing grueling treatments. His dreadlocks fell out from the therapy. His weight dropped to barely 90 pounds. But he clung to hope, believing that his faith and these treatments might save him. Rita and some of his children stayed with him during this ordeal. They watched as the vibrant, powerful man who had electrified stages around the world withered away. But even as his body failed, Bob's spirit remained unbroken. He talked about the albums he would make, the concerts he would perform, the message he would continue to spread. The final journey. By May 1981, it was clear that nothing more could be done. Bob wanted to die in Jamaica, to return home to the island that had made him who he was. Against medical advice, he left Germany and boarded a plane to Kingston, but his body couldn't make the journey. The plane stopped in Miami, Florida, and Bob was taken to Cedars of Lebanon Hospital, now University of Miami Hospital. His organs were failing. The cancer had won. The last words. On the 11th of May, 1981, at 11:45 a.m., Bob Marley died in a hospital bed in Miami. He was just 36 years old. His final words to his son Ziggy were, "Money can't buy life." The news sent shockwaves around the world. How could Bob Marley be dead? He seemed eternal, his music so full of life and hope. But the same cancer that kills thousands silently had taken one of the most famous people on earth. The legacy Bob's body was flown back to Jamaica, where he was given a state funeral, an unprecedented honor. Thousands lined the streets of Kingston to pay their respects. He was buried in a chapel near his birthplace in 9 Mile with his guitar, a frumas, Bible, and a marijuana bud, symbols of the things he loved most. In death, Bob Marley became even larger than he had been in life. His music continues to inspire new generations. Legend, a greatest hits compilation released in 1984, has sold over 28 million copies and remains the best-selling reggae album of all time. But the tragedy of Bob Marley's death remains. He died from a disease that might have been cured if he had accepted amputation in 1977. His refusal, based on religious beliefs, cost him his life. It's a reminder that faith and modern medicine sometimes collide, and the consequences can be devastating. Yet, perhaps Bob would have said it was worth it to live and die on his own terms, to never compromise his beliefs, even at the ultimate cost. As he sang in Redemption Song, one of his final recordings, "Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds." Bob Marley freed minds with his music. But in the end, his own body, ravaged by a disease he refused to fully fight, imprisoned him. The prophet who sang of liberation found his final liberation in death, leaving behind a message that will outlive all of us: one love. End word count. Approximately 2,200 words tentar novamente não usados e faça roteiro com no mínimo 2,700 palavras planejou narrativa cinematográfica contínua sobre Bob Marley. O usuário quer que eu crie uma narrativa sobre Bob. Marley sem dividir em matos e que tenha no mínimo 2,700 palavras. Preciso criar um roteiro fluido, detalhado e em inglês, contando desde o início da carreira até sua morte. Vou criar uma narrativa contínua, mais cinematográfica, com mais detalhes sobre sua vida, carreira e batalha contra o câncer. Bob Marley's Last Battle, The Disease That Silenced the Legend, A Detailed Narrative Journey. The story of Robert Nesta Marley begins not with triumph, but with struggle. Born on the 6th of February 1945 in the rural village of 9 Mile, nestled in the lush green hills of St. Anne Parish, Jamaica, Bob entered a world divided by color and class. His father, Norval Sinclair Marley, was a white Jamaican of English descent who served as a captain in the British West Indian Regiment. His mother, Cedella Booker, was a young black Jamaican woman of just 18 years. Their union was controversial, crossing racial lines in a society still deeply scarred by colonialism and slavery. Norval was 50 years old when Bob was born, and he was largely absent from his son's life, providing only occasional financial support. Bob grew up in poverty, raised primarily by his mother and her family. His mixed heritage made him an outsider, too white for some, too black for others. The other children called him White Boy, and this early experience of rejection would shape his worldview profoundly. Years later, he would channel this pain into a message of universal brotherhood, singing One Love to a world that desperately needed to hear it. 9 Mile was a place of breathtaking natural beauty and grinding poverty. Bob spent his childhood barefoot, playing in the red dirt roads, swimming in the rivers, and absorbing the rhythms of rural Jamaican life. Music was everywhere in the Pentecostal churches where his mother worshipped, in the work songs of farmers, in the sound systems that would set up in the village square. Bob's mother remembers him as a quiet, introspective child who showed an early gift for reading palms and predicting the future. He was different from the other children. She would later recall. He had something special in him. When Bob was about 12, his mother moved to Trenchtown, a government housing project in Kingston, seeking better opportunities. Trenchtown was a tough neighborhood, a concrete jungle far removed from the green hills of 9 Mile. But it was also the epicenter of Jamaica's emerging music scene. The yards of Trenchtown echoed with ska music, and sound systems competed for dominance, blasting American R&B and homegrown Jamaican rhythms. In Trenchtown, Bob met Neville O'Reilly Livingston, known as Bunny Wailer, who lived nearby and shared his passion for music. Together, they would sit for hours, fashioning crude guitars from bamboo and sardine cans, practicing harmonies and writing songs. They were joined by another neighbor, Winston Hubert McIntosh, who would become known as Peter Tosh.
The three young men formed an unbreakable bond, united by their love of music and their dreams of escaping poverty. Bob worked as a welder's apprentice, but his heart was never in it. Music consumed him.
He would spend every spare moment at recording studios, trying to get auditions with producers. In 1962, at just 17, Bob recorded his first singles, Judge Not and One Cup of Coffee, with producer Leslie Kong. They went nowhere, but Bob wasn't discouraged. He knew he had something to say, he just needed to find his voice. In 1963, Bob, Bunny, and Peter officially formed the Wailers later, joined by Junior Braithwaite, Beverly Kelso, and Cherry Smith. They auditioned for Clement Coxone Dodd, the most influential producer in Jamaica, who ran the legendary Studio One. Dodd was impressed by their raw talent and tight harmonies. He signed them immediately. Their first single under Dodd's guidance, Simmer Down, was released in late 1963. It was an instant sensation, shooting to #1 on the Jamaican charts and staying there for 2 months. The song, which urged Kingston's restless youth to simmer down and control their anger, resonated deeply in a society marked by violence and inequality. At 18, Bob Marley was a star in Jamaica, but stardom didn't mean wealth. The Jamaican music industry was notoriously exploitative, with producers keeping most of the profits while artists struggled to survive.
The Wailers recorded dozens of tracks for Studio One, including early classics like Soul Rebel and One Love, but saw little financial reward. Bob was supporting not only himself, but also his new wife, Rita Anderson, whom he married on the 10th of February 1966. Just a day after their wedding, Bob left for Delaware, where his mother had relocated to work in a Chrysler automobile assembly plant and at a warehouse. For nearly a year, he toiled at these jobs, sending money home while dreaming of returning to music. His time in America gave Bob perspective. He saw the wealth and opportunity that existed outside Jamaica, but he also witnessed the racism and oppression faced by Black Americans. He returned to Jamaica in 1967 with a renewed sense of purpose and a growing political consciousness. Around this time, Bob began exploring Rastafari, a religious and political movement that had emerged in Jamaica in the 1932. Rastafari taught that Haile Selassie I, the Emperor of Ethiopia, was the returned Messiah, that black people were the true Israelites exiled to the West through slavery, and that redemption would come through a return to Africa both spiritual and literal. The movement rejected Western society as Babylon, a corrupt system built on the oppression of black people. Rastafari also sacralized the use of marijuana and prescribed a vegetarian diet. Bob's conversion to Rastafari was total. He grew his hair into dreadlocks, a symbol of the Nazarite vow and of African identity. He adopted the Rastafarian lifestyle, smoking marijuana as a spiritual practice and embracing the philosophy of resistance to oppression. Most importantly, Rastafari gave Bob a framework for understanding his life experiences, the poverty, the rejection, the exploitation, and transformed his music from mere entertainment into a revolutionary tool. The Wailers' sound evolved alongside Bob's spiritual journey. They moved away from the upbeat ska rhythms of their early work toward a slower, deeper sound called reggae, which had emerged in Jamaica in the late 1960 seconds. Reggae's heavy bass lines and syncopated rhythms created a hypnotic, almost meditative quality that perfectly suited Bob's increasingly spiritual and political lyrics. In 1970, the Wailers began working with Lee Scratch Perry, an eccentric genius of a producer who pushed them to experiment with new sounds and production techniques. The collaboration produced some of the Wailers' finest early work, including Duppy Conqueror, Small Axe, and Soul Rebel. These songs showcased Bob's evolving artistry. His lyrics were becoming more poetic, more militant, more prophetic. The breakthrough came in 1972 when the Wailers signed with Island Records, founded by Chris Blackwell, a white Jamaican who had a vision of bringing reggae to the world. Blackwell gave the Wailers something no Jamaican producer had ever offered: a substantial recording budget, complete creative control, and access to world-class recording facilities. He also positioned them not as a novelty act, but as serious artists comparable to rock bands. Catch a Fire, released in April 1973, was unlike anything reggae had produced before. It was a complete artistic statement with sophisticated arrangements, powerful lyrics addressing political and spiritual themes, and production values that rivaled any rock album. Songs like Concrete Jungle, Slave Driver, and Stir It Up introduced the world to a new kind of reggae, one that was politically conscious, spiritually profound, and musically sophisticated enough to appeal to an international audience. The album was followed in October 1973 by Burnin', which included some of Bob's most enduring compositions: Get Up, Stand Up, a militant anthem of resistance; I Shot the Sheriff, a cryptic tale of rebellion; and the title track Burnin' and Lootin', which addressed the violence and poverty in Jamaica's ghettos. When Eric Clapton covered I Shot the Sheriff in 1974, taking it to number 1 in the United States, Bob Marley became an international sensation. But success brought its own challenges. Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer were uncomfortable with the grueling international touring schedule and felt overshadowed by Bob's growing prominence. In 1974, both left the group to pursue solo careers. Bob continued as Bob Marley and the Wailers, bringing in new musicians and featuring his wife Rita, along with Marcia Griffiths and Judy Mowat as backup vocalists, the trio known as the I-Threes.
The albums came in rapid succession, each one expanding Bob's audience and influence. Natty Dread, 1974, included No Woman, No Cry, which became one of his signature songs. Rastaman Vibration, 1976, reached number 8 on the Billboard charts, unprecedented for a reggae album. Exodus 1977 would later be named Album of the Century by Time magazine. Kaya 1978 showed a mellower, more romantic side. And Survival 1979 returned to militant political themes, with songs addressing African unity and anti-colonialism. Bob's concerts were transcendent experiences, whether performing in London's Lyceum, Theatre, the Roxy in Los Angeles, or before massive crowds in Africa. Bob had an almost supernatural ability to connect with audiences. His thin, wiry frame would explode with energy on stage, his dreadlocks flying as he danced and twisted, his voice carrying messages of love, resistance, and spiritual redemption. He was no longer just a musician, he was a prophet, a revolutionary, a voice for the voiceless. His growing political influence made him dangerous. Jamaica in the 1970 seconds was torn by political violence between supporters of Michael Manley's Democratic Socialist People's National Party and Edward Seaga's Conservative Jamaica Labour Party. The violence claimed hundreds of lives, turning Kingston into a war zone. Bob, with his message of peace and unity, was seen as both a potential bridge between the factions and a threat to those who benefited from division. In December 1976, Bob agreed to perform at the Smile Jamaica concert, a free event organized by the government to ease political tensions. On December 3, just 2 days before the concert, 7 gunmen invaded Bob's home at 56 Hope Road in Kingston. Bob was in the kitchen with his manager Don Taylor and several band members when the shooting began. Bullets shattered the evening air. Bob was shot in the chest and arm. Rita was shot in the head while sitting in a car outside. Don Taylor was hit 5 times and nearly died. Miraculously, none of the wounds were fatal. Bob's chest wound came within inches of his heart. Rita's head wound was superficial, the bullet grazing her scalp. 2 days later, despite his injuries and against all advice, Bob performed at the Smile Jamaica concert, appearing on stage for 90 minutes. When asked why he didn't cancel, Bob replied with characteristic determination, "The people who are trying to make this world worse aren't taking a day off. How can I?" The assassination attempt forced Bob into 18 months of exile in London. But even this couldn't slow his productivity. In London, he recorded Exodus, an album that perfectly captured his state-of-mind songs about movement, change, and spiritual journey. The title track became an anthem, with its driving rhythm and message of liberation. Jamming celebrated the unifying power of music. One Love, People Get Ready became his most famous song, a plea for human unity that transcended all boundaries. Bob returned to Jamaica in April 1978 for the One Love Peace concert. In an iconic moment that would be replayed for decades, Bob brought Michael Manley and Edward Seaga on stage during his performance of Jamming, and joined their hands above his head in a symbol of unity. The image was powerful, but the peace Bob hoped for remained elusive. Jamaica's political violence would continue. By 1980, Bob Marley was at the peak of his powers. He had just released Uprising, an album that included Redemption Song, perhaps his most profound composition, Just Bob. His guitar and words of liberation borrowed from Marcus Garvey, "Emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds." The album also included Could You Be Loved and Forever Loving Jah, songs that showcase both his commercial appeal and his spiritual depth. But beneath the surface of success, Bob's body was failing. In July 1977, during a friendly football match in Paris, Bob was a passionate footballer who played whenever he had free time. He injured his right big toe. It seemed like nothing, just another sports injury in a life full of them. But the toe didn't heal properly. It became darkly discolored and increasingly painful. When Bob finally saw a doctor in London, The diagnosis was devastating. Acrolentiginous melanoma, an aggressive form of skin cancer that occurs on the palms of hands or soles of feet. This particular type of melanoma is more common in people of African descent and is especially deadly because it's often detected late, hidden in places people don't typically check for skin cancer. The doctors were clear. The toe needed to be amputated immediately to prevent the cancer from spreading. But Bob refused. As a Rastafarian, he believed in the sanctity of the body, viewing it as a temple that should not be violated. Amputation was spiritually unacceptable. Rasta no abide amputation, he said. I don't allow a man to be dismantled. The doctors proposed a compromise, a procedure to remove the cancerous tissue and nail bed without amputating the entire toe. Bob agreed, and the surgery was performed. But the doctors warned him this might not be enough. The cancer could return, could spread. Bob chose to believe in the power of faith, of natural healing, of his own invincibility. He had survived poverty, violence, assassination attempts. He would survive this too. For 3 years, Bob continued his punishing schedule, touring relentlessly, recording, performing, spreading his message. The Uprising Tour took him across Europe, America in 1980. But those close to him noticed changes. Bob was losing weight, his clothes hanging looser on his already thin frame. He experienced headaches and dizzy spells. His legendary stamina seemed diminished, though his will remained as strong as ever. On the 21st of September 1980, Bob Marley and the Wailers performed 2 triumphant shows at Madison Square Garden in New York City. For a boy from 9 Mile to headline the world's most famous arena was the ultimate vindication. But the shows took everything Bob had. He had collapsed while jogging in Central Park shortly before the performance, though he told no one except his closest confidants. 2 days later, on September 23, Bob performed at the Stanley Theatre in Pittsburgh. During the concert, he collapsed on stage.
The tour was immediately canceled, and Bob was rushed to Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York for tests. The results were catastrophic. The melanoma had metastasized throughout his body. There were tumors in his
Brain, lungs, and liver. The cancer that had started in his toe had spread like wildfire through his body. The doctors gave him only weeks to live. Conventional medicine had nothing left to offer. Bob refused to accept this death sentence. In a desperate search for a cure, he traveled to Germany to see Dr. Joseph Isels, a controversial physician who ran a clinic in the Bavarian mountains. Dr. Isels offered a holistic approach, combining diet, immunotherapy, and experimental treatments. It was Bob's last hope. For 8 months, Bob underwent grueling treatments at Isels' clinic. His dreadlocks, his crown, fell out from the therapy. His weight dropped to barely 90 pounds. The powerful, energetic performer who had commanded stages worldwide was reduced to a frail shadow. But even as his body withered, Bob's spirit remained unbroken. He talked about the albums he would make when he recovered, the concerts he would perform, the message he would continue to spread. Rita and several of his children stayed with him during this ordeal, watching helplessly as the cancer consumed him. Bob remained hopeful, believing that his faith, combined with Dr. Issel's treatments, would save him. But by May 1981, it was clear that nothing more could be done. The cancer had won. Bob wanted to die in Jamaica, to return to the island that had shaped him, to be buried in the red earth of 9 Mile near where he was born. Against medical advice, he left Germany and boarded a plane to Kingston. But his body, ravaged by cancer and months of treatment, couldn't handle the journey. The plane made an emergency stop in Miami, Florida, and Bob was taken to Cedars of Lebanon Hospital. On the 11th of May 1981, at 11:45 inches the morning, Bob Marley died. He was just 36 years old. His final words to his son Ziggy were simple but profound. Money can't buy life. The news spread around the world like wildfire. Bob Marley, the voice of reggae, The prophet of peace, the icon of resistance, was gone. Fans from Kingston to Tokyo to London mourned. How could someone so full of life, whose music celebrated vitality and hope, be dead? Bob's body was flown back to Jamaica, where he lay in state at the National Arena in Kingston. Thousands filed past his casket to pay their respects. On May 21, Jamaica gave Bob Marley a state funeral, an honor typically reserved for national heroes and heads of state. Prime Minister Edward Seaga delivered the eulogy, calling Bob a man who brought Jamaica to the world and the world to Jamaica. Bob was buried in a chapel near his birthplace in 9 Mile, his final resting place overlooking the green hills where his journey began. His casket contained his cherry Gibson Les Paul guitar, a Bible open to Psalm 23, and a stalk of marijuana, symbols of the three things that mattered most to him: music, faith, and his Rastafarian beliefs. In death, Bob Marley's legend only grew. Legend, a greatest hits compilation released in 1984, became the best-selling reggae album of all time, with over 28 million copies sold. His music continues to inspire new generations, transcending language, culture, and time. Bob Marley became a symbol of resistance, hope, and unity, everything he had sung about in life. But his death remains a tragedy of what might have been. Medical experts agree that if Bob had accepted the recommended amputation in 1977, he would likely have survived. The melanoma, caught at that stage, was treatable. His refusal to amputate, based on his religious beliefs, cost him his life. It's a reminder of how faith and modern medicine can collide, and how the consequences of such collisions can be devastating. Yet perhaps Bob would have said it was worth it to live and die according to his own principles, to never compromise his beliefs, even at the ultimate cost. He had sung, "Get up, stand up for your rights." He stood up for what he believed in until the very end. Bob Marley's message was about liberation from mental slavery, from oppression, from hate. His own body became his final prison, but his spirit, captured in hundreds of songs, remains free. As long as people sing One Love, as long as Redemption Song inspires listeners to emancipate themselves from mental slavery, as long as Three Little Birds reminds us that every little thing is gonna be all right, Bob Marley lives on. The boy from 9 Mile who dreamed of changing the world through music succeeded beyond his wildest imagination. His life was brief but blazing, a comet that illuminated the darkness and left a trail of light that will never fade. Bob Marley proved that one voice, backed by courage and conviction, can indeed change the world.